Acts 28, we'll begin in verse 1 just a second. Last time, if you haven't been with us through our study here recently in Acts, Paul is being transported from Caesarea there in Palestine to Rome. He has appealed to Caesar. He's been proven innocent 5 times, and yet they won't release him. They won't set him free. The Jews are insistent on some kind of prosecution, hopefully to get him killed. But he has appealed to Caesar, and so that's where they're going, and they're taking him to Caesar. But it's been an eventful trip so far. The weather has been not cooperating with them, but God knows exactly what He is doing. And so, actually, last time we saw them crash the ship, swim to shore on the island of Melita, or Malta, as we would know it as. And God is proving Himself to be faithful and true. Paul is becoming a leader. He's a prisoner on this trip. There has a centurion, other soldiers guarding him, but he's becoming a leader because he's sharing God's instructions for their protection. You remember, Jesus told him at Jerusalem he would go to Rome. He would spread the gospel there. And so he knows he's going to make it to Rome. It's everybody else that's in question on the ship with him. He's going to make it regardless. And so, but God has driven them in this hurricane called in our scriptures Euroclydon, this horrible northeast wind there. And it's driven them straight from Fair Havens and Clauda there in that area there, and it's driven them straight to Malta. And even though they can't see it, you remember last time they heard the waves crashing on the shore. That's how they knew they must be close to some kind of body of land there. And so that's when they started checking the depth of the water, and they realized the water's getting shallower, so we must be moving to the land. And the fear is that a big ship like that, they didn't take to land. They docked it out in the bay, and they would take the dinghy, or we would call it a lifeboat maybe, but it's a shore boat is what it is, a smaller boat that they would let down and take that to shore. And so, but they don't want to crash this thing into the shore if they can help it. But they did cast the anchors out the back of the ship, and which keeps the ship then facing the island, because that's the direction they're being driven. And so then you remember the crew was pretending to drop some anchors out to the front of the ship, but they were actually doing what? Letting down the dinghy. Letting down the lifeboat. They're going to bail on everybody else and try to make it to the shore themselves. It'll be much easier for them to survive a crash into the shore with the little boat than it would for the big boat to come slamming in. And people get tangled in the wreckage and all kinds of bad things happen. So they're going to make a break for it. Paul, though, sees them, tells the centurion and the soldiers that if they're going to live, everybody got to stay in the ship. That's God's instructions. And you remember the soldiers just run over there and take their swords and cut the ropes. Let the thing go crashing into the shore and into the waves, and it is gone forever. But they do wait for the day when day breaks and they can see a creek emptying there into the water there on shore there, and they were going to try to drive the ship into that place, assuming that would be a little bit deeper water there. Didn't see the sandbar that sits in the middle of that bay because of the big waves there. And so the front of the ship gets stuck in the sand, and then the rear of the ship starts breaking up with the waves. And the soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners. You remember, if a prisoner escapes, whoever's accountable for them has to take their punishment. And so they're afraid some of them are going to swim away and escape, and they're not going to get to trial. And so the soldiers wanted to kill them all. But the centurion doesn't want to kill Paul. He knows he's innocent, and so he doesn't want to kill him. Plus, he's the one they're getting the instructions from in order to stay alive on this trip. And so they don't want to get rid of him. And so he prevents that, and they tell those that can swim, cast themselves into the sea, swim towards shore. The others start grabbing pieces of the ship, boards, whatever they can find that'll float, and kicking themselves in. And by the grace of God, all 276 passengers on the ship do make it safely to land. And so that's what we're starting at this week. And we're actually closing in on the last part of Paul's trip to Rome, and we'll see that this evening, and then Lord willing next Wednesday evening, and we'll probably conclude the book of Acts next week. But here in Acts chapter 28, verse 1, read down through verse 16 this evening. He says, "And when they were escaped, then they knew that the island was called Malta. And the barbarous people shewed us no little kindness, for they kindled a fire and received us every one because of the present rain and because of the cold. And when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, there came a viper out of the heat and fastened on his hand. And when the barbarians saw the venomous beast hang on his hand, they said among themselves, No doubt this man is a murderer, whom though he hath escaped the sea, yet vengeance suffereth not to live. And he shook off the beast into the fire and felt no harm. Howbeit they looked when he should have swollen or fallen down dead suddenly, but after they had looked a great while and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. In the same quarters were possessions of the chief man of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and lodged us 3 days courteously. And it came to pass that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and of a bloody flux, to whom Paul entered in and prayed and laid his hands on him and healed him. So when this was done, others also which had diseases in the island came and were healed, who also honored us with many honors. And when we departed, they laded us with such things as were necessary. And after 3 months we departed in a ship of Alexandria, which had wintered in the isle, whose sign was Castor and Pollux. And landing at Syracuse, we tarried there 3 days. And from thence we fetched a compass and came to Rhegium. And after 1 day the south wind blew, and we came the next day to Puteoli, where we found brethren and were desired to tarry with them 7 days. And so we went toward Rome. And from thence, when the brethren heard of us, they came to meet us as far as Appii Forum and the 3 taverns, whom when Paul saw, he thanked God and took courage. And when he came to Rome, the centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard. But Paul was suffered to dwell by himself with a soldier that kept him." Now, we've talked about this before. Paul wanted to go to Rome. He's wanted to go to Rome for several years. And Psalm 37 is a reminder for us about how God does some things and how God blesses us with certain things. In Psalm 37 in verse 4, and I believe this applies to Paul's life as well, he says, Psalm 37:4, "Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart." Now, Paul has things that he wants to do. He has desires, hopes, dreams, those kind of things, plans. We were talking to the college students before church about what the plans are and what we're going to do going forward. And they've got a plan lined out. I'm telling you, it sounds like a good one. but we make plans in those things. Not all of those plans work out, do they? No, not all of them. But God does bless us with certain things when we delight in Him first. When we put Him first. And so Paul is delighting in the Lord. And so the ones that he gets, the delights of his heart that he gets, they are a tremendous blessing to him. The other things that he isn't allowed to do don't even matter. Now with Paul, we've talked about that. Paul wanted to go to Rome, and then he wanted to go to where after that? Spain. As far as we know, Paul went to Rome, and then what? He dies. He doesn't go to Rome as far as we know. And so, but that, huh?
You mean Spain?
Spain, yeah, sorry. When I say Rome? Yeah, he went to Rome. He wanted to go to Spain. Yeah. But as far as we know, he didn't even matter, because he went to glory, even better. But he was making plans. Psalm 145:19 says the similar thing there, but it's conditional. He says, "He will fulfill the desire of them that fear Him. He also will hear their cry and will save them." And so there has to be that right kind of perspective. It can't just be selfish desires, things that we want for ourselves and not for God's glory. And But what we're seeing back in Acts here, in Paul's life, is faithfulness of God is blessing a faithful man. Paul has been faithful to God, and God is in turn being faithful to bless him in these things. And we're going to see this evening from the shipwreck to Malta or Melita and then on to Rome. But they have all made it to shore here originally, and we wouldn't exactly say safe and sound, but they're in one piece, right? They're in one piece. Most people don't like being outside in a storm, even a regular storm. I know we had a little taste of something. It wasn't a hurricane, but we had some pretty good storms the other day, and I was just out in it for a few minutes, and I thought, I need to get in a building or something. I don't want to be out in this. And it's a little sketchy, and so we don't want to be in that. And this is the aftermath of a hurricane. And certainly they don't want to be in that. They have been pelted by the rain and the wind, and there has been the danger of flying debris and all those things. And now God is going to use the hospitality of the heathens here to help them. God does use unsaved people and saved people for His purposes. Now, that being said, and we'll see this a little bit longer, there's no eternal blessing for an unsaved person for doing those things. There is a present blessing, though, for them. God does give certain blessings to those who help God's people and show kindness to them, hospitality, those type of things. But it won't matter in eternity because they're not saved. If they get saved, then they would have eternal rewards. But we understand this is a pretty good act of hospitality that they offer to these strangers that have now crashed on their island. Now, hospitality we know that's a requirement for preachers. We get that 1 Timothy 3:2, a bishop or a pastor then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, and then apt to teach. But we also know Romans 12:13. That should be in every Christian's life. In order to be a preacher or pastor, you have to have demonstrated that up front. But all Christians are supposed to have that. All are supposed to have hospitality. In Romans 12:13, he says, distributing to the necessity of saints, given to hospitality. That's in the Christians in general. That's not just preachers. Matthew 10:40, we won't turn there. You'll know these verses. We studied them a while back. But we know from Matthew 10:40 and following those verses that our service to others as God's children is really a service to Christ. And you go through that whole list, and Christ says, you saw me thirsty and hungry or naked or in prison. You didn't do anything. And they come back and say, well, when did we see you? And he said, well, when you did it not to the least of these. That you should have been doing it like it was for me. And then, of course, there were others that did that. And Christ said, it was like you did it for me. And they got rewarded for that. And so that's how our service is. But sometimes we may be hospitable or showing some type of kindness to others that God is using. And we know that. Hebrews 13:2, sometimes that may be angels that we don't even know they're angels. Hebrews 13:2 says, be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. We wouldn't even know it sometimes. Now we know in Genesis 18, Abraham and Sarah found themselves the host to two angels. And who was that third guy with them? That was Christ, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ in the Old Testament there. They didn't know that originally, did they? No. Abraham sees them, he goes out, welcomes them, going to feed them, and finds out later that that's who they are. But, as Christians, that should be common for us to show kindness, to hospitality, even to strangers. And, it should be embarrassing for us when you see these people from Malta. They're heathens. They're not saved people yet. Now, some of them will be saved, but they're not saved yet. And it really should be embarrassing for us as Christians when people in the world outdo us in the means of hospitality, kindness, compassion, those type of things. We should be the leaders in that group. We should be setting the example for everyone. Our motive is to serve Christ. We do that because we want to represent Christ to the world. Their motive is only just an act of compassion or maybe for the praise of men or something like that. And so we should be much better at that than everybody else. But look here in Acts 28:1. He says, and when they were escaped, then they knew that the island was called Melita. They didn't know that this was Malta at first, right? Because this isn't the normal place that ships would land. Now, why don't ships normally land in this port? Because there's a big sandbar there. And when they hit that sandbar, it's concealed by water sometimes, even worse during a storm or a hurricane. So this is not the normal bay that they would land at. The normal bay, if you care, is Valletta. That would be the normal place that you would land at Malta. That was the most common thing. But Malta, or Melita, was given that name. The island was named by the Phoenicians. Now, where are the Phoenicians from? You remember? What is it?
I said Venice.
No, not Venetians. Phoenicians. Well, the Phoenicians are that area along the coast there in Palestine. Tyre, Sidon, those two cities are Phoenician cities. Very wealthy cities, those two places are. And so the Phoenicians named this place there. They were great sailors. Now we know Tyre and Sidon, they have a great export business. They made some dyes and things that were very valuable, and they exported them all over the world. And so they were really great sailors of that day. And Melita is actually the Phoenician word that means refuge or escape. And so there were ships that took refuge here. And we'll see that close to the end of this, where there's another grain ship that was in the same shape. They weren't caught in the storm, but they did spend the winter at this place, at this island, because we talked about before, you went from November, middle of November to the end of March. That's the dead zone. Nobody sailed during that time because you're going to crash your ship somewhere. The weather was just too sketchy and they couldn't move fast enough to avoid it. And so here in Acts 28 verse 2 it says, and the barbarous people shewed us no little kindness, for they kindled a fire and received us every one because of the present rain and because of the cold. Now the people of Malta are described as barbarous people or barbarians there. Now they're not actually what we would call barbarians. When we think of barbarians, we kind of think of uncivilized people. That's not what these people were. Right? Why are they called barbarians or barbarous people? Well, anybody who didn't speak the Greek language was called a barbarian by the Greeks. They thought they were just uncivilized, uncultured. Right? The reason they got that name is because they said when other people talked, it just sounded like bar, 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 right? Just nonsense. And so they called them barbarians or barbarians. That's where that name come from. It was really a kind of an insulting name for the Greeks to use, but it's not uncivilized. That's not what this means. It just means they didn't speak Greek. And so this is early to mid-November now, and it's not really frigid weather in Malta at this time of year, but it's, you know how it is when it gets 55 or 60 degrees and you get soaking wet with rain and you're out in the wind, right? Well, then 55 or 60 degrees is really cold when you're soaking wet and chilled to the bone from the wind and those type of things. And so it's very unpleasant for them at this time. And the natives took them in, all of them, criminals and all. Remember, Paul's an innocent prisoner, but there are some guilty ones on this ship too. Right? And so they took them in. Now, we can assume that the storm is now passing, or at least has died way down, but But this is very cold weather, and so they are stirring up this fire, building a huge fire to warm all the people. Now, it's going to be a pretty big fire if you can warm 276 people by it. It's a great big bonfire is what it is. Right now, we understand this. Once you get a fire going, you can throw wet wood on it. You can throw green wood on it. You can throw just about anything you want on it at that point. And what will happen? It'll still burn. Right? The water will evaporate off the wood and it'll go ahead and catch fire too. But, how do you get a fire started with wet wood? Yeah, gasoline, no. How would these people get a fire started with wet wood? They wouldn't. The Maltese people start this fire. In order to start this fire for all of these people, they have to give up what? Dry wood. They have to sacrifice their dry wood in order to warm these people. And it really is an act of kindness there and an act of sacrifice. How can we show kindness, let alone love to people, if we're not willing to sacrifice something for them? I don't know how. There has to be some kind of sacrifice involved. And so they have all kinds of limbs and debris, even pieces of their own ship that's washed ashore. They've got wood. Right? It's just wet wood. The Maltese people are the ones that have dry wood, and unless they use their wood and get this fire started, they won't have any fire. They won't be able to warm themselves. And so, sometimes we think what little bit maybe we could give really wouldn't make much of a difference to other people. Well, we should know from the widow's mites in Jesus' day that that's not true. She gave less in amount than the others, but what did Jesus say? She gave more. It's not really how much we can give. It's, are we willing to sacrifice? Are we willing to allow God to take a little bit and turn it into a lot? What would have happened to the 5,000 people plus women and children if the little boy hadn't sacrificed his lunch? Jesus used that to multiply it and feed the thousands there. And so, there isn't, as we said before, there isn't any eternal benefit for these people because they're not saved yet. But they are going to get a temporary blessing for showing kindness to God's people here, especially Paul and his friends. And we've studied that recently from Joseph in Potiphar's house and then in prison and then with Pharaoh, how God was blessing them because of Joseph. It wasn't because he necessarily was honoring the nation of Egypt, certainly. We talked about the same thing with Jacob and his father-in-law. You remember Jacob's father-in-law was being tremendously blessed as long as Jacob was there working for him and trying to marry the daughter, right? And then the other daughter, right? But you remember that he was being blessed tremendously. And then the father-in-law, he's getting ready to go out on his own, and he says, oh, well, you can have these type of cattle that are born. And well, then next thing you know, God's giving him all those kind of cattle. And he says, oh, well, no, I'm going to change it now. You can take this kind, and I'll take those kind. And what does God do? God switches it. Next thing you know, those are coming out all the time. And so the same thing is true. God does bless those who show kindness and are good to God's people, but those who show unkindness and are cruel and those type of things, deceitful, then they may suffer for that too, for the same reason. So Acts 28 verse 3 there, he says, and when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, there came a viper out of the heat and fastened on his hand. Now they're shipwrecked on this island. They're victims of the Euroclydon, that horrible storm, the hurricane there. They're guests to the Maltese people who are showing them this great kindness by starting this fire for them and allowing them to warm themselves. And what does Paul do? He serves others. He helps with the fire there. He leads by example and he starts collecting limbs, right? There's no doubt debris everywhere from this storm. And so he starts collecting some of those limbs, throwing on the fire. They're all weak, right? You remember they fasted for 2 weeks, Right? They did take some food right before they had to swim or float to shore or whatever they were doing for their strength there, but still, you go 2 weeks without food, you're pretty weak. They are also exhausted. And you add on to that, Paul has some other health issues that most of the other people don't have to deal with. Right? And so, but he's still collecting wood for the fire, for all of them to be able to enjoy there. Even though he's obviously the leader by this time, he's not just barking out orders, is he? No. Right? He doesn't tell anybody else to do that. He just leads by example there and doing what he can do to help. And so, but he grabs this bundle of sticks when he gets close to the fire there with that bundle of sticks. A snake that was in that bundle comes out when it gets close to the fire there and latches onto Paul's hand. Now, a viper is, of course, a poisonous snake. This is serious, right? We have a few poisonous snakes. I heard somebody talking about a rattlesnake. Was that around here? Somebody had a big rattlesnake. I heard somebody talking about one Sunday about something, but yeah. But copperheads are probably the biggest thing we have around here. And I do know a lady who was out. She lives up on a hill, and they're in the wooded area there. And she was gardening at her own house, and reached down in the garden to mess with a plant or something, and a copperhead bit her on the hand. Okay, but it bit her on the hand. You remember when that went down? She almost lost her hand. That's with modern medicine. You'd think, okay, today we get bit by a poisonous snake, you get in the car, you go to the hospital, they'll take care of you. Yeah, that's exactly what they did. They got in the car, got to the hospital as fast as they can. She's a nurse, right? And they did everything they could, and she still almost lost that hand. Right? But by the grace of God, she didn't. Right? Now, you can imagine how much worse it would be in Bible times with the very primitive medicine they have at that time. Right? You only need to look back at Numbers 21 if you need a reminder of that. You remember when God sent those poisonous snakes among the Israelites in the wilderness because of their complaining. You remember what happened? You get bit, you do what? You die. Right? And of course, God has Moses make the brazen serpent, and it's an act of faith. If you look to that, if you trust to God, then you live. But otherwise, you get bit, you die. There was no other options. Right? There wasn't any way out of that. And so, God didn't let Paul survive 14 days in a hurricane just to have him die by a snake bite, did he? No, of course not. But God's doing something. He's doing this on purpose. We think when bad things happen, and why is this happening to me? My buddy had to have his roof torn off his house, and the soffit's gone, and he's got all kinds of things going on over there, and can't get the insurance adjuster to call him, and all those kind of things. And he says, I'm going to go to church tonight and see what's wrong with my life. I teased him. I said, it may be the company you're hanging out with. But, that's kind of how we think sometimes. Bad things are happening. That should be a go-to for us that, check our own lives, make sure God's not chastening us for something that's sinful. That should be. But also we have to understand, God lets bad things happen to us for opportunities to witness through those things. It's an opportunity. It's not just something that God's trying to punish us with. We understand God controls the weather. He also controls the animals, doesn't he? Yes. We've seen that multiple times in Jesus' life. Also in Jesus' life, God did not shield His only Son from all of those things, did He? Jesus was in the boat with the disciples when that thing was getting ready to sink, wasn't He? He was in there. You remember the disciples woke him up and says, carest thou not that we perish? If the professional fishermen on the boat think they're going to drown on the Sea of Galilee, what's getting ready to happen? They're getting ready to drown on the Sea of Galilee. They're getting ready to lose the boat. That's what's going to happen. These guys weren't green. They knew what was happening, and they knew that thing was going to go down, and they were all going to die out there. But Jesus was in that boat. he had to go through that storm too. Now, of course, at the end of that, Jesus proves that I can calm that sea, right? But God didn't keep him from it. He didn't shield him from those things there. He was in it with them. Right? And Acts 28 verse 4 says, and when the barbarians saw the venomous beast hang on his hand, they said among themselves, no doubt this man is a murderer, whom though he hath escaped the sea, yet vengeance suffereth not to live. Now, the Maltese people see Paul get bit by this poisonous snake. They know it's the end. This guy's going to die. That's just what happens. When somebody gets bit by a poisonous snake, they die. When they get bit, the wound site would swell, the poison would spread throughout the body, and then they die. And that's just how it was. There's nothing else they could do about it. And so their conclusion is Paul must be a murderer. He must be a murderer. Even though he has escaped this horrible storm on the sea, justice is now being served, and he's going to die for his crime there. Now, we talked about that. Bad things don't just happen to bad people. And Jesus is an example of that. But you see this word vengeance given here in this word. Vengeance suffereth not to live. Now the word for vengeance is the Greek word dike. Dike. Sounds similar to Nike. Nike. We pronounce it what? Nike. Nike was the god of victory. Right? DK was the god of vengeance or justice. That was a Greek fake god. Now, guess what the Roman name for the actually that's a goddess, but you know what the Roman name for DK is? Justia or justice. Justice. They're saying, oh, justice, the fake goddess of vengeance, is not going to let you get away with this. That's what they're saying in this verse here. There. And so these pagan people, they know right from wrong, don't they? Of course they do. Every civilization, every backwoods tribe, aborigine, doesn't matter where on the planet, every people group, everywhere on the whole planet, for all of time, knows the difference between right and wrong. We're born with it. We're born with a conscience. Now, we can train our conscience, or we can abuse our conscience and harden it, sear it, those type of things. But every person has a sense of right and wrong. Every culture has rules about what they feel is right and wrong. And of course, some corrupt those and turn away from God's things. But they have a sense of right and wrong there. The problem is they know there's some kind of higher power that should punish wrongdoers. The problem is they don't know who that higher power is yet. They don't know God is the higher power. They've just got some of this nonsense from the Greek culture and the Romans, and so that's what they're attaching themselves to. The idea's right, their theology's just wrong there. And so, but God has built that into us. If you want the proof of that from Scripture, go back and read Romans 1 and 2. It talks about how that's in us. And so, Acts 28:5, though, they're expecting vengeance is going to get him. It's going to kill this murderer. But, he says, and he shook off the beast into the fire and felt no harm. Well, the thing bites him. It's unpleasant. But he shakes it off into the fire so it can't harm anybody else and goes on. Right? What does Paul not do? Well, he doesn't panic, does he? No. He doesn't run around and act like a crazy person, does he? He's not eat up with fear, is he? That should be us, even when crisis happens. I was talking to Cindy. She was out there at the house way too early today, and I thought they didn't have mail or something there. And I said, "What are you?" She started talking. That paper was rattling on Dylan's house, and I couldn't hear nothing. I had to walk across the road. I said, "What are you doing out there?" it's flooded out there on Route 7. I'm going to have to drive around Coal Branch. It was just, like, okay, it's just what we're going to do today. It's going to be different. We're going to do this early, and then we're going to go somewhere else. And I like that. It wasn't, I don't know, I'm going to be out there, I'm going to have to go all the way around, all the way back. I don't know if I'm going to get home from church, and we got power out at the house. I didn't hear any of that. Right? Why should we act like crazy people when God is allowing those things to happen for a reason? Right? And Paul's just got bit by a poisonous snake, and he just shakes it off like it was a mosquito. Right? That's how he acts. And, not that we wouldn't be concerned. But some things are beyond our control. There is no need to panic. There is no need to act like a crazy person. There's no need to act like the world that doesn't have God in charge of their life there. And so Paul knows God. So it's the same as when he's on the ship there. God has already told him that he's going to go to Rome. So, he's got bit by a poisonous snake. But Paul has to know in the back of his mind, well, this may be unpleasant, but I'm not going to die. Because God's already told me I'm going to Rome there. And so, this is actually a fulfillment. I do want to look at this. So look over in Luke chapter 10 just a second, because some have twisted some of this around. This is a fulfillment of prophecy in Luke chapter 10, verse 17 through 20. And it says, "And the 70 returned again with joy, saying, Lord, even the devils are subject unto us through thy name. And he said unto them, I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. Behold, I give unto you power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you. Notwithstanding in this rejoice not that the spirits are subject unto you, but rather rejoice, because your names are written in heaven." And so what he was saying there, the fear of demons, or the fear of poisonous beasts, whether that be a snake or a scorpion or whatever, anything else, that wasn't to stop them from doing God's work. I got tickled. Christina probably told you the same thing, Lori, when they was predicting those storms on Tuesday, and her mom or somebody called her and said, "They're not going to make you work in that, are you?" And yes, they are. We're just going to go, and if we can't go, we'll stop. But yeah, we're going to have to work in the weather, but we're trusting that God's going to protect us. And the same thing's true with those people when Jesus told them, said, yeah, you're going to face some scary things at times. Right? Things that you weren't expecting. God's going to protect you. Even if they accidentally stepped on one of those poisonous snakes, got bit, something like that. You notice here in Acts chapter 28, Paul is not taking this snake and teasing it and toying with it and handling it and twirling it around. He's not doing any of that, is he? This is an accident. There's an accident. And God protects him through that there. We're not going to bring snakes into the church, tempt God, and pretend like we can handle them and we'll be immune to those. That's foolishness. Jesus didn't do that when Satan tempted him to jump off the temple, and we're not going to do it either. That's not the meaning of those verses there. Right? What is Paul doing here? He's ministering to others, serving others, and God protects him through that. Over in Mark 16, similar verse, Mark 16, 17 and 18. He says, "And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall take up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." It's the same idea. Did Paul take up a serpent? Yeah, because it latched onto his hand. Not because he was handling it and playing with the thing. That's the same idea there. And so they weren't to drag snakes into the church. They weren't to drink poison for a show. Those were accidental things there. But they were miracles. Right? God was going to do that, use that for a certain group. And we talked about that. The book of Acts is a transition time for the church there. Why do they need a transition time? Why are some of those things applicable for them that aren't necessarily applicable for us? They didn't have what written down yet? The New Testament. The New Testament. So when they told something about Jesus' life and the gospel and the coming kingdom, those type of things, there were some of that referred to in the Old Testament. But to tie that together, we need the New Testament to complete that information. So how would people possibly believe them if they came up with something new in the New Testament? If God gave them a miracle to do, healing somebody, doing those type of things, get bit by a poisonous snake and it doesn't kill you, something along that lines, then that would confirm to those people, hey, this is somebody that God is using because God is protecting them. God is doing miracles through them. And so it was to confirm the message until the New Testament was completed. After it was completed, we don't need to do those things anymore. Right? Yes, God still heals people. Right? We don't have faith healers like the apostles were, because the message has already been confirmed. God doesn't have to do that any longer. Right? We pray and God heals miraculously. That still happens all the time, and praise the Lord for it. It's just not the same as when they did it there. And so Acts 28:6, back to our original text there, he says, howbeit they looked when he should have swollen or fallen down dead suddenly, but after they had looked a great while and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. Well, when Paul doesn't die, right, should have died, but didn't die, they changed their mind and assumed that he must be a god. Now, Paul's not trying to be God. That's a satanic endeavor. Satan wants to be God. He's not trying to be God. That's obvious from earlier ministries. Right? You don't have to turn there, but back in Acts chapter 14, you remember God had allowed, he's with Barnabas in Acts chapter 14, God had allowed them to heal a lame man. And the people thought they were gods. You remember they called them Mercury and Jupiter. That was two of the Greek gods there. And they were going to offer sacrifices to them. And they're speaking in their language. And Paul and them didn't understand. And finally they figured it out. No, they said, no, we're just men like you. God has done the healing, not us. Not us there. And so they're just representatives for God, not gods themselves. Verse 7 there, Acts 28, he says, In the same quarters were possessions of the chief man of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and lodged us 3 days courteously. Now, Publius is the protos. He's the chief. He's the foremost. Right? The historical accounts call him the governor of Malta. That's his position. Kind of like Felix and Festus were the governors of Judea, or King Agrippa was he would be the leader of the province there adjacent to that same position. So he's the head over the island, Publius is. He takes them into his quarters, into his own home, into his own guest chambers for 3 days. Now that's a tremendous act of hospitality to take these people into his home. Look at verse 8. He says, And it came to pass that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and of a bloody flux, to whom Paul entered in and prayed and laid his hands on him and healed him. Now Publius' father has a couple of health problems. Now fever is one of them. Now, depending on what the fever was, many times in Bible times, if you got a fever, that was death, because they didn't have any way of dealing with it. Didn't have antibiotics, and the body's overheating and infection spreading, those type of things. And so a lot of people, when they got fevers in Bible times, they just died. But he also has a bloody flux. Bloody flux. Now the Greek word is dysenteria. All right? Any idea what that is? Dysentery. That's what it is, dysentery. Now, dysentery is a very unpleasant gastrointestinal disease. It has diarrhea, fever, nausea, vomiting, weight loss, and severe stomach cramps. Dysentery is very unpleasant, but it usually passes in a week. Now, if you can last the week, normally it'll just go away. Right? But it's very miserable experience for that week, but most people do survive from dysentery. When there's bleeding involved from the bowels, you may have to help me, some of you nursing students. Bacillary, is that the word? B-A-C-I-L-L-A-R-Y? Okay, anyway. Bacillary? Okay, we'll take that. Bacillary dysentery is a different animal. If there's bleeding from the bowels there, that is much more serious. It's very contagious. And it can be life-threatening. You can die from that. And that's obviously what this man has. He has a bloody flux. He's got the bacillary dysentery. He's got the worst kind there. And so now we see again, though, how God helps those who have helped His people. This man's son has kept them in his own home for 3 days. Not a saved person. Just an act of hospitality, just an act of compassion on them. And now Paul heals this man by God's power. Now, historically, the founding of the first Christian church in Malta is credited to the Apostle Paul. They even named that bay where the sandbar is after him. It's named after him even still today. Right? Guess who the first pastor of the church in Malta was? Publius. That's who's credited with being the first pastor of this church. Right? And God has given the apostles power to do miracles at this time to confirm their message. Did Paul preach to them here at Malta? Of course he did. Of course he did. And some have believed and been saved, and the church starts here. Now look at verse 9, Acts 28:9. So when this was done, others also which had diseases in the island came and were healed. Others came to be healed too. When they figure out this guy can heal people by the power of God, they bring their sick people. And when they bring their sick people to Paul, they're going to get healed by God's power. But what do you know Paul's going to do for them? You're going to hear the Word of God. You're going to get that too. It's a twofer there. And so if we look ahead to verse 11, we know that they're here for 3 months. Now in 3 months' time, Paul started churches in just a few days in some places. A week, few weeks, month and a half. But if he stays 3 months, he's got time to teach the Word of God to a lot of people, even help some mature a little bit in that amount of time. And so the people on this island, they have a desire to know God. And so God shipwrecks Paul here. And he's got a couple other Christians at least with them. Luke and Aristarchus are with him also. And so they get that Bible teaching from them so they can know Him. God has sent them here for 3 months for that purpose. Now look at Acts 28:10. He said, who also honored us with many honors, and when we departed, they laded us with such things as were necessary. What did they have when they landed on this island? Nothing. Why not? What they didn't throw overboard to lighten the ship with crashed into the sea and is gone. So they have nothing there. Just a few months' time, these people who are being saved on this island now have a great love for them, and they help them with the necessities that they're going to need for the next part of their journey. There in verse 11, he says, and after 3 months we departed in a ship of Alexandria, which had wintered in the isle, whose ship was Castor and Pollux. And we talked about, I guess I could put our map up here, but we talked about this before. Huh? Oh. Sign was Castor and Pollux. This ship is from Alexandria. We talked about Egypt is a great supplier of grain, especially for the Roman Empire. They transport that stuff all over for the Roman purposes. And so this is a port. Here, there's Malta, by the way. So there's another grain ship that has to stop here and stay for the winter and couldn't go on. And so they get on this ship there, similar to the one that they were just on. Only this one's made it there safely there. And so The deadly sailing time is now gone. If you care, Castor and Pollux, the sign on this ship, that's the twins that are called Gemini. We got a constellation somewhere. It's called Gemini, and that's the twins there. It's supposed to be the sons of Jupiter and the gods of navigation. Superstitious, but that's the ship they're on, if you care. Verse 12, they land at Syracuse. That's right here. That's in Sicily. There, they stayed there for 3 days. And verse 13, and from thence we fetched a compass and came to Rhegium. And after 1 day the south wind blew, and we came the next day to Puteoli. Now, they're going from here up to here, and then they cross through here. Puteoli is up there. Fetched a compass. That means they're tacking back and forth into the wind. There, that's what they're doing, and they made it up there. Puteoli, by the way, is a grain port, so that's probably where this ship is going to unload at. Verse 14, he says, where we found brethren and were desired to tarry with them 7 days, and so we went toward Rome. Now, that's the end of the sailing portion of the journey. Right? From here, they're going to walk the rest of the way. They land here at Puteoli, and they're going to have to walk the rest of the way to Rome there. That's where that ship was stopping at. And so they get some Christians to fellowship with for a week, and then they start the march toward Rome. And they're traveling on there's a famous highway there, the Appian Way. That's the name of that road, if you care, very popular Roman highway at that time. Verse 15, he says, and from thence, when the brethren heard of us, they came to meet us as far as Appii Forum and the 3 taverns, whom when Paul saw, he thanked God and took courage. And so when the brethren hear, you see these 2 places, Appii Forum, 3 taverns, that's still a good ways away from Rome. That's still a lot of walking to go. When they find out Paul has started from Puteoli coming that direction, they go down there to meet him for what purpose? Just to walk with him. Just to keep him company on the journey there. Encourage him on the way. It's been 3 years since Paul wrote the letter to the Romans, to the church at Rome. Right? He's been longing to go there, to them. And now they've come all this way to usher him in. They love Paul. But most of the people from the church at Rome, if not all of them, they don't know Paul. Right? Haven't met him yet. The only way they know him is from the letter that we have in our scriptures that he wrote to them. Right? They haven't met him yet. He hasn't been there yet. Right? And so the reverse could be said also. Paul cared for them and loved them enough to write the letter that the Holy Spirit inspires him for their benefit, and he hasn't met them either. Look at verse 16. He says, and when we came to Rome, the centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard, but Paul was suffered to dwell by himself with a soldier that kept him. Now the others go to prison, but they're turned over to the captain of the guard. Right? Paul gets a personal attendant, a soldier, to keep him there. He has his own private quarters. He's under house arrest. Right? Now this probably isn't as nice. You remember when he was in Caesarea, way over here. Right? He was staying in the Hall of Judgment. That was a converted palace. That was a really lavish place for a prisoner to get to stay all that time there. So this probably isn't quite as nice as that was. But it's still much better than a common prison there. And he gets to stay here. Right? If you look down to verse 30, just to skip ahead a little bit, he has to pay for this house. Right? He says, and Paul dwelt 2 whole years in his own hired house and received all that came into him. So he has to rent this place. He has to pay for it, but he still has the same kind of freedoms that he had back in Caesarea. He can have all the visitors he wants. He just can't leave. He's got to stay there. But he can have whoever he wants, and he can prevent whoever he wants from coming to him, right, outside of the Roman officials there. So it is a tremendous blessing, and God has just lavished him with kindness from all of those different people. And it's because of his faithfulness to God. Right? God isn't keeping him from trouble. He's going through different types of troubles all along the way. Some of them pretty bad, even in our estimation. But God is still blessing him through those things. Right? You remember, he's gotten friends now to accompany him. Luke and Aristarchus paid their own way. They're not prisoners. They're not workers on this ship. They paid for passage to get there. And, of course, he had friends inside, and you remember way back here in the area of Phoenicia, there along the coast. He had friends inside and who helped minister to his health needs before they ever took off on that leg of the journey there. The Maltese people showed him great hospitality, provided for their needs when they left. Even in prison, Paul gets protection, but he gets all of that liberty to be able to minister to others and have visitors. And so every need that Paul has had, God has met. Right? It doesn't matter if that's food or whether it's medical attention or protection or fellowship, God has always come through. Right? Maybe not what we would call ideal circumstances, but God has always been there through all of those things. Next week, Lord willing, we'll finish up the book of Acts. But any questions or comments this evening?